What is up, guys? Lord Nick here, bringing you another One Piece related video. This video, guys, is going to be breaking down the OP08 meta. How do I perceive the early meta going? As well as where do I believe Rebecca stands in it? Kind of what are our best matchups, what are our worst matchups, and what are matchups that are somewhere in the middle. Before we dive into that video, guys, yeah, I get it. I saw the comment, I saw the likes. I know people want meta matchups, and I'm going to say it again, just because sometimes people in the back don't hear this or you don't watch it all the time, so you don't know. I am going off of what matchups I can just find on the fly for most of those videos. When I am making meta matchups, they're going to be coming in the form of the, what are they called? Success for Dressrosa series, and that is specifically where I am trying to evaluate its matchups into meta matchups, where I'm also trying to give you a breakdown of how you can play into these meta matchups to get a better idea of them. Otherwise, gameplay that I'm doing there is just to showcase the lists that I'm showing off. This video will not have gameplay, just FYI, so if you're looking for it in this one, doesn't have it, sorry. But, let's jump into it. Let's jump into our meta tier list. Sorry for the little bit of blur. I had to expand it so that it fits to the screen, so it might look a little blurry. But, starting us off, we're going to start off with, kick it off with the S tier. I don't think this comes to any surprise to anybody, other than maybe the fact that I've snubbed a few decks and I've moved some other decks around a bit. But I think that the meta this early on, this meta will be something along the lines of Reiju, Lucci, Bonnie being kind of the top decks. Lucci, I thought, had enough hit to him that he would be falling off. People are adding in more Ice Ages. They're going into a little bit more of a Navy build. And we're just finding out that, hey, a leader that has natural cost reduction and graveyard filling or trash filling is really, really good. So he's bumped back up. I think this is going to be the last meta where Gecko is also going to be super, super relevant unless we get more Gecko Moria support in the future. He is not necessarily a bad deck in any way, shape, or form. I think he's a very solid deck, but he's not getting a lot of support, and he might get outclassed by other decks here in the future. There's not a whole lot to write home there. Oh, I just realized that I did leave King off at the the C tier. So just add King in there. But outside of that, I think Gecko is just a solid deck. So early on in the meta, I think these will be the top performers, just because they're the top performers of the last meta. On top of that, most of them get some. So in the case of like Bonnie, she gets some new cards. Reiju's just good, so she doesn't really need new cards, but there are some cards for her to play around with and test out if she wants. As for Lucci and Gecko, the black cards, they get Jack, which Jack is really strong, but I don't think, I mean, he's going to be in every black deck, but, you know, that's about the card that they're getting. That you might see, because Lucci can use him, Huzu will be added in. Card is really good. He might replace I would hope that he will replace something like Kaku, 5-drop, 6-drop, whatever he is. The pop 3 Kaku, he should be replaced by Huzu, but that would be the other change that gets made. Now, when we look into the A tier, I think this is where it gets a little bit more unique, a little bit more interesting. We have some new contenders and some people that have fallen out. So, for Yellow's sake, we have Vegapunk. And the reason I'm putting Vegapunk here is that the new cards, while they are good for Yellow in general coming out, your Namis and your Bonnies are really good cards. They make Vegapunk very, very good. This deck cheats out characters, can heal himself. He's super versatile. Yes, he starts at low life, but as Rebecca has proven to you guys on this channel, being at low life isn't a problem all the time. You know, as long as you know how to play around it, as long as you know when to take the damage and when to not, you're going to be okay. And in the case of this, where you get to just start cheating out really good static characters with good effects, I don't think there's a problem with it, and he actually goes shooting up from being kind of a meme deck to being very good. Red Purple Luffy is making a comeback. We got some decent red cards coming out this set. Rayleigh is really good for this deck. We had some decent cards from the last set coming into it. The purple cards coming into this Black Maria can be pretty nice to drop right after you do a 10-drop Luffy turn. You may or may not run it. There's going to be a lot of deck testing with it, but I think that the deck is actually in a much better spot than people had originally realized. And towards the end of last meta, people were like, wait a second, with Law going out, this is the red-purple deck right now. And so I think he's going to shoot up. Black Yellow Luffy doesn't really gain any tools from this set. There's nothing in this set that really makes the game plan that people are going with Black Yellow Luffy currently better. Like, Nami is a card that can be run, but like, I don't know if you necessarily run it in this list. So right now, at least, I think the deck is relatively solved unless somebody comes up with a new way to play it. This is going to be one of the last times that it's going to be towards the top of the meta, because it's just going to kind of get left behind. People have solved it, so people have solved the matchup into it. It's still really strong right now and still forces people to play a certain way, but I would not be surprised if Black Yellow Luffy just starts falling off a cliff here soon after. Marco, I think, is the more unique guy out of the current leaders coming out this set. He has the highest potential to be in A tier. I think Calgara could be, but the thing about Calgara is he is kind of a one-track game plan. So as decks like Bonnie, Lucci, and Gecko do relatively well into that one-track game plan that he has. So as we get deeper into the meta, I think he falls off. So we've dropped Calgara down. But when we're talking about Marco specifically, why is Marco in the A tier? What do I think that Marco has? Well, I think he has some access to some really epic cards. Phoenix Brand is a superiorly underrated removal piece. Yes, you have to show off 2 Whitebeard cards, but if you're playing a majority Whitebeard cards in your deck, like you kind of should be with Marco, because they synergize really well with the leader, then guess what? You actually have a really good control deck, and Phoenix Brand is an insanely good control card. Yes, Marco reduces power instead of cost, but the fact that it hits a 6 cost is super, super relevant, and it's only 4 Dawn. So even the downside of, oh, look, you get to see these cards, if you're planning to play those cards, it's not a downside. Because if you're going to play one of those this turn, so say, like, for whatever reason, on turn 7, and you reveal 2 3-drops, or 4-drops, or some 2Ks, or whatever. Don't show the 2Ks, probably, because you kind of want to hide that fact. But show off some cards that you don't mind your opponent seeing. And then you play one of those cards. Now your opponent only knows 1 card in your hand. On top of that, you probably Marcoed. You can Marco after you use it to then put one of those cards into your deck, and now your opponent doesn't know what card you have and what card, if you got rid of one of the cards they saw, if you didn't. It really messes with their knowledge of what's in your hand. So even though they knew 2 cards, they know one of those cards is there, they don't know which card is there. Or both cards could be there. So, like, Marco has a lot of ways to deceive and play around his opponent's knowledge and then restack it for himself. I think ultimately this deck is going to be a brewer's paradise, and a person that wants to play kind of an aggro red-blue deck, you could, because of all the dang rush cards that it has options to now. But on top of that, it could just be an insanely good control deck. Thus, I think Marco, because of his versatility, because of how good of a leader he is, he's going to be in the A tier for me. Perona, no surprise, stays here. She gets Jack added to her pool of cards, but the Wano package is just so dang powerful that if there's not an increase of blue decks, which there will be towards the time that Dofi starts coming around, but early on in the meta, she's just going to be kind of feasting on these stuff. So as soon as we start seeing more blue decks, we might see a new build to where she might fall down a bit. Zoro's just coming out the gates with the Chopper build, and I think this is going to be a really, really good aggro deck. He has the potential to really disrupt how the meta is currently going, which is nice. We haven't had a purely aggro deck that has been seeing a lot of success over time recently, other than Law, but with him gone, the void of an aggro deck kind of comes in, and I think that Zoro is going to fit that role pretty well, and ultimately will be a pretty good deck. Now, the last tier we're going to really go diving into is the B tier. The B tier is your rogue decks. These are the ones that could do well, but I see kind of having a little bit of struggles because of their game plan or difficulty to pilot. So Calgara is just the game plan, and we kind of addressed that. Is a one-track game plan. It's really kind of easy to counter, and so once you kind of understand the fact of what he's trying to do, you just kind of let him hurt himself, clear his board, play for clearing his board state, and then you go in to finish him off. Which, you know, easier said than done, because he does get to cheat out a lot of really high-statted cards, potentially, but ultimately he is kind of a one-track game plan of just beating you down, and if he ever falls behind in that game plan, you're going to win. Note, he will have a crap ton of cards in his hand, so putting is a very good guard into him. So as we get into more blue meta, I think is where he will settle into the B. So I could be wrong of where he starts off. He could start off in A, but I didn't want to overflood the A, so I put him at top of B. Enel has fallen down. I think that Vegapunk is better. I think that Calgara is better going into this meta because of the fact that the general route for Enel is Starve. And Starve is solid, except for the fact when there are multiple decks that like to be playing for the long game. Bonnie likes to play for the long game. Lucci can play for the long game still, despite losing stage. Black Yellow Luffy likes playing for the long game. Red Purple Luffy technically plays for the long game, but they get to the long game significantly faster than you do. And their threats are devastatingly high costed cards. And then, Rebecca is a deck that's not really up there, but she plays for the long game. Boa plays for the long game. Marco can play for the long game. So, Perona plays for the long game. All these other decks are like, yeah, sure, fuck it, we can play late. And then he's like, well, shit, that destroys my game plan. So unless we see more of hey, we just shove every yellow rush card into an L and just play off of leader power keeping us alive, I don't really see an L taking a huge foothold at the top of the meta. He's still very good, don't get me wrong, but I think that the Starve has kind of overstayed its welcome and is pretty much beatable by most of the decks right now. Then we have Boa. I think Boa is actually a really good deck. She should technically be higher on this list, but a lot of folks were really, really pining for the tempo-ish build that we're going to see in Dofi. I think that she can run some of those tempo cards pretty dang effectively because they just give you good stats on board, but she is ultimately better when you're running. Oh, sorry, guys. Super tired. Anyhow, she's significantly better when you run her more as a control list. So running your top end more like the Mihawks and less greedy like a Secret Kaido to refill your hand. So you run your Mihawks and maybe some Borsalinos and stuff that's just good at removing cards. She actually is very, very good, but that kind of requires people to retool and rebuild and kind of revisit her. And I don't know if a lot of people do. For some reason, blue is just kind of the snubbed color unless it does something just absurdly broken. And yes, she is very powerful, and I honestly think she's verging on potentially broken if people actually built her and played her correctly. But that requires, again, some experimentation in building, and not many people do that. Rebecca is in that same category. As you guys can tell, I really love Rebecca, and I think that she's actually in the rogue trying to push up into higher tier meta. But there's a couple of matchups that I think are bad enough that she really can't push past it, at least right now, unless they start trying to change their builds to deal with other certain decks, then maybe Rebecca has a chance. But for now, because of the fact that we're seeing Ice Ages in Lucci, because we're seeing potential of Ice Ages in Gecko again, Bonnie is actually a good matchup for us overall, I would say, though there are some annoying cards that they now have access to. And then Reiju is just able to get such high-costed characters out so early, can be a bit of a problem. But because of that, I've put her a little bit lower. Foxy, I think, is slept on. I think the deck actually has a lot of disruptive power that can be pretty good if piloted correctly, and we've seen it here in my locals. There's two guys. One of them's known as one of them take the title of Foxy of the South. The other one took Foxy of the North. It's really funny, and both of them do relatively well, mind you. A lot of people might be like, oh, Foxy's a meme deck. The deck is just a meme. Our meme nights banned Foxy because of these guys. Because of two players in particular. People are like, nah. They also banned Rebecca. And I think that's partially because they're like, Nick will just show up for this randomly. But you can call these decks memes, but if they're memes, why are they banned for meme night? Dragon, on the other hand, is just me honoring a friend of mine, more or less. I think Dragon has potential to be really good. Red has access to a lot of really aggressive cards, and I think Dragon has that potential to utilize those really aggressive cards in a better way than most other red decks. And I think he could be really good if you just stop building Rev Army, but again, experimentation, so we'll leave him at Rogue. The ones in C, these are ones that either are going to get a buff later on, so the 6 starter decks that it will get buffs later on, so they will be a different meta overall when that happens, or they're just the new leaders. Like I said, King should be in there, and there hasn't been a list that has cracked these leaders yet, so I'm not really evaluating them higher than this. I want to honorably mention them because they all should technically be leaders somewhere on this list, but with the ones getting buffs later, they're going to be reevaluated then. And then for the actual other ones, because I haven't really seen a list that says, damn, that's the list, They're not really solved. They're not really built. I just don't see them being better than something else on the list above them. So the list for Rebecca going into OP08. So if you haven't watched my most recent video, this is the list that I have settled on. Yes, I've taken out using the the big guy, the Jozu that I was talking about previously, how I kind of raved and ranted about how good this would be. If the decks felt more starve oriented, I think we'd be fine. But when we look at this tier list, the A tier is a lot of more or less kind of mid-range aggro-y decks. The top is kind of a mid-range control-ish kind of decks. So because of that, Jozu kind of falls in this really weird spot. He's really solid into tempo and control decks, but stuff that leans towards the flood the board or mid-range aggro, like go wide instead of go tall, I think is somewhat bad for him. He's better in a go tallish kind of strategy. For those that don't understand that, go tall is having one narrow pathway of attack, which would be you stack everything onto one character and go. Like you develop a character and stack the rest on leader and swing. That's a strategy that Jozu's decent into. Whereas when it's just continue to go wide, we're going to see issues. And I thought with the banning of Law, my read was going to be, oh, it's going to be less of a go wide meta. It's going to be more of a go tall meta outside of black, but we're already 50-50-ish on Lucci, and we're doing really good into Gecko. I didn't think it would hurt us in those matchups. But, you know, the only deck that's really going tall right now might be the Vegapunk, might be the Red-Purple Luffy, arguably Bonnie, but she still goes kind of wide by throwing out crap tons of blockers. So, like, everybody else just goes wide, other than Nell, and I think Nell got worse. So, if that's the case, then Jozu's just a bad pick. But when we look at the list, the biggest additions are Jack. He's just kind of a staple for all black decks now. He's just such a good 7-drop, and he's recurable by Rebecca, and becomes very difficult for other black decks to deal with. He is still answerable by blue because they have red rocks, but if he eats a red rock, I'm kind of okay with that because he's more of a secondary win condition. So, if he eats it, that's fine. That makes my Aramaki stick better. That makes my Kuzans do better. So he's just a really good added threat. And he makes my Luffy stay better, which is really nice because that card just killed 2 things supposed to kill 1 thing. So when we look at it also, we've added in Husus, which gives us another 4 2K counters, which is awesome, while also being additional removal pieces on curve actually helps deal with the Reiju matchup a little bit better as well from the limited testing that I've been able to do with this particular list. But when we move into it, guys, what matchups do I think are good? What do I think are bad? What do I think are okay? So we're going to look at the bad matchups first. These are going to be our worst to the best of worst matchups. I think Reiju is our best of worst. So we're going to start off with our worst. I think Perona is single-handedly our worst, and the biggest reason for this, I don't have a single pudding in here. If I toss in a couple of puddings, which, mind you, I am of the camp, if you are not running Gecko Moria, you need to run 4 puddings because you need it so badly for that 1 or 2 matchups that you're playing around that you need it. And the chances of milling it when it's a 2 of or getting stuck in your life when it's a 2 of is way too high. So maybe you run it as 3. 3 would probably be the argument, I guess, actually. So finding space for 3 of them in here would be replacing our Husus, which I think are just universally better against most other matchups. So I am sacking the Perona matchup, specifically because that's the only matchup where I deem it that I have to have a fucking pudding. Now, if you are playing into Anels, if you're playing into these other decks that like to get stacky big hands like Bonnie's, you might be thinking, well, that's where I need a pudding. No, not really, because a lot of those, so while, yes, the Anels might have just tons of 2Ks in their hand, 10K swing does a really good job of cleaning that up. Or swinging a, I don't know, swinging a 10K into an 8K that gets a 2K and a 1K, and then doing it again with a Luffy with 3 Dawn on it, gets the same thing, and then Luffy again gets the character. Yeah, that's 3 swings into the character and not pressuring the Anel's life, but he just lost a lot of resources for it, and we don't really have to worry about that. Whereas with Perona, the cards in her hand are generally going to be 2Ks or stuff that allows her to just recontrol the board. And because her leader ability just shuts down half of our deck, she's just problematic for us as a matchup. So trying to tool into this matchup is just whatever. I don't see enough Peronas currently for me to be like, that's the deck I need to really tool into. I'm just counting this as a loss. I'm not working on making it a better matchup for us. You can choose to do that if you want and experiment in finding ways to make it better. But note, when you do that, you are going to sack into some of the other matchups. So I honestly am saying it's okay to have one absolutely dog matchup, which is Perona, as long as the rest of my matchups get better. Rob Lucci is still problematic. With the Ice Ages being added in, they have options for our late game. Hopefully we can bait them into using the Ice Ages at the wrong time, which then enables our late game cards to be difficult for them to deal with. Jack is also a card that could potentially give us some power into this matchup, but I honestly think this is still either a 50-50 or slightly Lucci favored, just because he has consistent ways of dealing with us, but I need to test it more with OP08 cards. Maybe it's going to get better for us. The only testing I've had into OP08 Lucci was when I was playing my OP07 lists, and I was forced to play into the Eastern meta, which I didn't want to do. Lastly, we have Vinsmoke Reiju. So, Reiju has been the bane of our existence for a long time. A lot of people think, oh man, this is the worst matchup we have. No, I don't think it is. I think when it high rolls, yeah, but I think when it high rolls, it's everybody's worst matchup. So if it's not high rolling into double Ichiji by turn 2, I think we can legitimately, we have a good chance of beating this deck. It is the argument for why we might consider Houndblaze over Gravity Blades, but I am keeping Gravity Blades just for Bonnie, and I don't want to make that matchup so much worse that it's something that we can't beat. So because of that, we're keeping the Gravity Blades. Grav Blades can do pretty well into Reiju later, so it's there. It's just about learning to survive, learning to be okay at being at 2 life, and focusing which targets we need to focus of killing opposed to bottom decking. And it's pretty easy. You can kill basically everything except for Ichiji. You need to bottom the big Ichijis. And the reason you need to bottom them is so that they don't have them to activate. If they can't activate them, their pressure is so much less that we can just handle it. They don't run a lot of removal. We can handle it. So it's just about focusing the prio targets correctly, which is KO everything except for Ichiji's. Bottom deck that motherfucker if you can. And then once he's all gone, you can start bottoming other stuff. But that is your prio bottom target, and then you just kill everything else because they can't keep pressure up. And if they can't keep pressure up, we inevitably burn them out of stuff that they can do. Good matchups for us. So we're going from bad to good. So what are our good matchups? I think our best matchups of the decks that are at the top of the meta will be Gecko. We just feast on that deck no matter which way they start to try to build it. It's just very difficult for them to keep up tempo into us because of the fact that we're just going to go 1-for-1 every turn. And if we're 1-for-1ing, yeah, they can get stuff back. But if they're only swinging in with leader, if we can start putting out blockers, inevitably the leader is only going to be swinging for 7. If he keeps swinging for 7, it's going to be bad for them. On top of that, if we go first, we want to try to put a stage or something out so that we stay under 5 cards the entire matchup. If we stay at under 5 cards the whole matchup, his Peronas are off, his tempo is off, his ability to control us is off. Ultimately, we have one of the best case scenarios for dealing with Gecko. He's also the only one you want to be on odd curve for. Anyhow, Vegapunk, I think, is actually a pretty good matchup for us. I've started trying to play into it more. I've learned from some local guys, some of the stuff that they do with it. I would say that it can be kind of rough for us if they get the nuts. But there's not really the nuts that we need to worry about in terms of like all the time, right? Like it can be, but it's just in the same way of just like, oh man, if Reiju hits double Ichiji by turn 2, we lose. Yeah, okay, Vegapunk does that with some of his setups with Namis or just constant good triggers early to fill up his hand and get a giant board state. Yeah, we're gonna get boned, but oftentimes I found that a lot of them like to be a little bit greedy and have at least 1 to 2 late game cards in their hand, as they also take up just their early game cards and try to set up a little greedy like. And if they set up a little greedy because of the fact that we can't swing, we're okay with that. The longer it takes for them to set up and get ready, the better we are with it. Their leader can't swing into us, so there's no pressure there. We're on even playing field in that regard. So it's just about controlling board, and our deck is really good at controlling board, whereas their deck is built more along just kind of survive and build up a big board. So if that's the case, we can deal with that. And then Red Purple Luffy. This has been a deck that when it first came out was the bane of my existence, and as time has gone on, I found that this matchup is relatively free. Black Yellow Luffy could be up here, but I've already explained how I think he's kind of falling off. Red Purple Luffy I think is just starting to amp up again. So Red Purple Luffy, I think, is actually still one of our better matchups. He relies very heavily on trying to ramp to 10 as fast as possible. So if we can answer his Zoro or whatever he plays out super early, then before it gets its ability. Ugh, sorry, a little bit of yawns. Very, very tired, apparently. But if we can answer his early game, then once we get into the late game, we really just have to play around that 10-drop Luffy turn and be at 2 life by the time that he's trying to do that with at least 1 blocker up, and then he cannot kill us, and we can usually get a crackback that wins us the game. So ultimately, it is a very good matchup for us. It just really takes a little bit of time to learn it a little bit, understand which are the problem cards early, along with what are the how do you play around it in the late. But Sabos are really good in this list. Into this list, blockers in general just really good into it, and making sure that if he's playing pops, if he's playing the Edward Newgates, just make sure they get bottom decked. Keep them off the board basically, and we'll win the game. As for the middle of the line matchups, these are the matchups that could go really either way. I am being respectful to Bonnie, and I'm putting her here. That's going to be the kind of like elephant in the room. A lot of you might be like, well, you said Bonnie was our free matchup last set. Well, yeah, she was, but now she gets some new tools, and I just want to be respectful of that. The fact that she's getting carrots added in can be problematic potentially. I say potentially. I think that we run enough 8s and higher that it's not necessarily a problem, but I want to respect the fact that it can stop our Luffys, it can stop our Kiroses, it can stop Haj Runans from getting up. So I want to be respectful of that aspect, because it could be, it could be super annoying, and it could cause some problems for us. I don't think it will, but we're going to be respectful of that and Electric Luna, and we're going to put her in the middle of the line matchup for now until I get better testing into the changes that she's making in the deck. I have tested into Zoro a ton. Zoro has the potential to be fast enough that we can't handle him. I, in the past, have been able to handle him because he just throws down weenies, and the weenies are easy to kill, and their dawn efficiency isn't really there. The chopper build is a lot of 4K attackers that you get to cheat out from other 4K or 5K attackers, which just makes Zoro super happy. You're throwing down mid-game cards that he then gets to buff for 1 dawn, and they're all actually on board to attack now. That's problematic, and so because of that, it actually is a little bit more difficult to deal with. And a lot of Zoros that I've seen recently have started to realize, oh, wait, if I start putting Rayleighs into my deck, it gives me a solid end condition that can remove some board state that could be sticky for me. Let's do that. And so, yeah, so Zoro now has a bit of a late game. Its early game is better. It is not a 100% win for Zoro into us. I still think I'm about 50-50, which makes this a middle-of-the-line deck. But because of that, I think Zoro can be a little problematic for us, and it could be good, it could be bad. Marco, on the other hand, I have very mixed feelings about in terms of the matchup between Rebecca and Marco. The control Marco, I think we're actually kind of okay with. It is a little annoying, and he has good card draw, and he has good deck stacking, and he's very good removal, so he could arguably be a really bad matchup for us. But I haven't found a good Marco pilot yet that I've been like, this is the guy that like is showcasing the best Marco. I haven't run into people that have been like devastatingly brutal with this deck. I think the deck has the potential to just absolutely clobber us. But for now, because people are still learning it, and I think that the deck itself was perceived as somewhat weak by a large part of the community, which I think is crazy, but for a little bit it was perceived as kind of weak, which is odd. I think that people haven't put as much time into learning it yet, and it might have turned off enough players that we don't see that many Marcos. If that's the case, then maybe he is kind of a sleeper pick and we don't have to worry about it as much. But if people start learning it and people actually figure out that it's pretty dang good, then I might see that this deck goes into sorry. He's teetering on the bad side of the middle of the pack. Zoro is teetering on the exact 50-50, and Bonnie's teetering on the good side of the 50-50. So honestly, Marco could go to being a really bad matchup for us, but it kind of just depends on how he evolves and what people think his build is. If they think that, oh man, it's just an aggro deck that gets to keep throwing out 4 or 5 drop rushers, that can be annoying as hell, but if he doesn't have a lot of good removal to get rid of our blockers, then hey, I don't have as much issue. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think he's going to have a decent amount of removal with a decent amount of rush, which does make him difficult for us to deal with. But that being said, guys, this is the video. This is kind of my breakdown for the upcoming meta. This is the breakdown for the upcoming early meta, by the way. This is not like this is what the late game meta will look like. No. By the time we get to the starter decks, the meta is going to be shifting a ton. And that's probably going to be called like 8.5 meta at that point. By 8.5, the meta is going to look completely differently. On our way to 8.5, after Nats, we're going to probably see the meta shake up a lot. And that's just because people will have more time to start experimenting. We're going into the early meta, and there's not as much experimenting that's going to be happening right off the bat. So this might be a slightly postponed meta, and so early on, this is kind of my read of it. Hopefully you find this video insightful. And if you did, please leave a like. Leave a comment down below to let me know what it is that you guys are interested in going forward. We will be trying to do more meta matchup breakdowns for Rebecca. Obviously, that is kind of the goal, but it kind of comes down to work schedule, school schedule, and all that stuff. And until the next video, guys, I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye, guys.